Welcome to Sigil Sanctum, where we explore the darkest corners of occult history and forbidden knowledge. I'm your host, and today we're about to embark on a journey that will take us through over 3 millennia of terror, madness, and supernatural horror. We're going to uncover the truth behind one of the most dangerous and powerful grimoires ever created, a book so cursed that it has left an unbroken trail of death, possession, and damnation across the ages. This is not just another tale of ancient magic. This is the documented history of humanity's most catastrophic encounter with infernal forces, a story that begins with the wisest king who ever lived and ends in the very depths of hell itself. But I must warn you, the knowledge we're about to share has driven men to madness, toppled kingdoms, and opened doorways that should never have been opened. So dim the lights, check your sword, and prepare yourself for the terrifying true story of the Clavicles of King Solomon. Our story begins in the golden age of ancient Israel, in the year 970 BC. During the reign of King Solomon, a man whose wisdom was said to surpass that of all the kings of the earth. The Bible tells us that God granted Solomon knowledge beyond any mortal man, but what the sacred texts don't reveal is the terrible price Solomon paid for power that transcended divine blessing. Solomon ruled over a kingdom that stretched from the Euphrates River to the border of Egypt, commanding the loyalty of nations and the respect of distant empires. His palace gleamed with gold, his temple housed the Ark of the Covenant, and his wisdom drew visitors from across the known world. But for Solomon, divine wisdom was not enough. He craved the ultimate knowledge, dominion over life, death, and the supernatural forces that govern both. It was during the 20th year of his reign that Solomon made his fateful decision. Historical records hidden in the depths of the temple archives speak of a series of dreams that plagued the king for 7 consecutive nights. In these visions, a figure wreathed in shadows appeared to Solomon, offering him knowledge that would make him not just the wisest of men, but the most powerful being to ever walk the earth. The entity that appeared to Solomon identified itself as Asmodeus, Prince of the 9 Circles, Lord of Lust and Wrath, and one of the 7 princes who rule hell under Lucifer himself. Asmodeus revealed to Solomon the existence of an ancient cosmic hierarchy, a supernatural order that predated human civilization and governed the forces of creation and destruction. According to Asmodeus, this knowledge had been sealed away by divine decree since the fall of the angels, but it could be recorded in a single tome that would grant its possessor absolute power over the supernatural world. The price for this knowledge was simple. Solomon must willingly open a doorway between the earthly realm and hell, allowing demonic forces limited access to the human world. Solomon, consumed by pride and the intoxicating promise of unlimited power, accepted the bargain. What followed was the most ambitious and dangerous magical undertaking in human history. The creation of a grimoire that would serve as both a manual for controlling infernal forces and a permanent gateway between dimensions. The king assembled his most trusted scribes, high priests, and scholars, swearing them to absolute secrecy under penalty of death. Working in hidden chambers beneath the Temple of Jerusalem, these men began the painstaking process of transcribing the forbidden knowledge that Asmodeus dictated to Solomon during nightly seances. The grimoire was not written on ordinary parchment. Solomon commanded that the pages be crafted from the skin of 13 criminals who had been condemned to death for the most heinous crimes: murder, blasphemy, and sorcery. The ink was a carefully prepared mixture that included mercury from the mines of Spain, sulfur from the volcanic slopes of Mount Etna, powdered diamonds from the mines of India, and most significantly, the blood of 7 different types of sacrificial animals, each representing one of the 7 deadly sins. The binding process alone took 3 months to complete. The grimoire's cover was fashioned from human skin, specifically the hide of a convicted witch who had been burned alive for attempting to curse Solomon's court. The spine was reinforced with strips of metal forged from meteoric iron that had fallen from the heavens during a solar eclipse, and the entire volume was sealed with clasps made from silver that had been blessed by the high priest and then cursed by Asmodeus himself. Each page of the grimoire contained not only written text, but also complex geometric diagrams, astrological charts, and sigils that seemed to writhe and move when viewed directly. The scribes who worked on the project reported experiencing disturbing visions and prophetic dreams, and 2 of them died under mysterious circumstances. Before the work was completed, their bodies found without any signs of violence, but with expressions of absolute terror permanently etched on their faces. The completed grimoire contains 7 major sections, each dealing with a different aspect of infernal magic. The first section detailed the hierarchy of hell, providing names, ranks, and specific summoning procedures for over 200 demonic entities. From the lowliest imps to the mightiest this section included detailed illustrations of each demon's appearance and their particular areas of influence over human affairs. The second section contained rituals for binding and controlling supernatural forces, including methods for trapping demons and physical objects, compelling spirits to serve the summoner's will, and techniques for opening permanent gateways between the earthly realm and other dimensions. The third section focused on necromancy and communication with the dead, providing detailed instructions for summoning the spirits of the deceased, compelling them to reveal hidden knowledge, and in some cases, temporarily returning the dead to life. The fourth section dealt with divination and prophecy, including methods for seeing into the future, locating hidden treasures, and uncovering the deepest secrets of one's enemies. This section also contained warnings about the potential consequences of gaining forbidden knowledge. The fifth section contained curses and hexes of unimaginable power, including rituals that could destroy entire bloodlines, bring plague and famine to vast regions, and damn souls to eternal torment even before death. The sixth section provided instructions for achieving supernatural longevity and power, including rituals for stealing life force from others, methods for transforming the human body to withstand demonic possession, and techniques for achieving a form of immortality that came at the cost of one's humanity. The seventh and final section was the most dangerous of all. It contained the complete ritual for summoning Lucifer himself, along with detailed instructions for making pacts with the Prince of Darkness. This section was sealed with additional protections and could only be opened by performing a preliminary ritual that required the sacrifice of 7 innocent lives. When the grimoire was finally completed, Solomon decided to test its power with a grand summoning ceremony. On the night of the winter solstice, in the deepest chamber beneath the temple, Solomon performed the ritual to summon Asmodeus not as the entity who had appeared to him in dreams, but as a fully materialized demonic presence in the physical world. The ritual required the participation of 13 priests, each representing one of the tribes of Israel, and the sacrifice of animals representing the 7 deadly sins: a lion for pride, a peacock for vanity, a pig for gluttony, a serpent for envy, a goat for lust, a bear for wrath, and a sloth for spiritual laziness. As Solomon chanted the forbidden words written in the grimoire, the temperature in the chamber dropped so rapidly that the walls began to form ice crystals despite the underground location. The 13 oil lamps that illuminated the chamber began to flicker with flames that burned blue, then green, then a color that seemed to exist beyond the normal spectrum of light. The floor of the chamber began to crack, and from the fissures emerged a sulphurous smoke that carried with it the screams of the damned. The very air seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe, and several of the participating priests began to choke and gasp for air. Then came the sound, a low, rumbling noise that seemed to emanate from the very foundations of the earth. The walls of the chamber began to shake, and ancient stones that had been set in place by the master builders began to crack and crumble. Finally, as Solomon spoke the final words of the summoning, a circle of hellfire erupted from the center of the chamber floor. The flames reached nearly to the ceiling but gave off no heat. Instead, they radiated a cold so intense that it burned like fire itself. From within this circle of impossible flame, Asmodeus emerged in his full glory. The demon prince stood nearly 8 feet tall, with skin like polished obsidian and eyes that burned with the light of dying stars. His body was humanoid but clearly not human. Muscles rippled beneath skin that seemed to absorb light, and his fingers ended in claws that could rend both flesh and soul. 3 heads crowned the demon's massive frame. The center head was that of a handsome man with features that would have been beautiful if not for the malevolent intelligence that burned behind his eyes. The head on the right was that of a ram, with curved horns that gleamed like burnished bronze, and the head on the left was that of a bull, with eyes like molten gold and breath that smoldered with infernal heat. Asmodeus spoke in a voice that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, addressing Solomon in a language that was older than Hebrew, older than any human tongue, a language that bypassed the ears and spoke directly to the soul. "So, wise king," the demon prince intoned, "you have completed the work and opened the door. The knowledge you sought is now yours. But remember, every word written in that book, every ritual performed, every demon summoned, brings you one step closer to joining us in the eternal flames." Solomon, drunk on his own power and the intoxicating presence of supernatural forces, demanded that Asmodeus demonstrate his authority by revealing hidden knowledge. The demon prince smiled with all 3 of his faces and began to speak of secrets that no mortal man should know. Asmodeus revealed the location of treasures hidden throughout Solomon's kingdom, told him the names of his enemies and their plans against him, and provided knowledge of alchemical processes that could transmute base metals into gold. More significantly, the demon granted Solomon insight into the fundamental forces that governed life and death, revealing methods for extending human life far beyond its natural span and techniques for commanding the loyalty of both the living and the dead. But with each revelation, Solomon felt something within himself changing. The wisdom that had once come from divine inspiration was being replaced by a cold, calculating intelligence that viewed human life as nothing more than a resource to be exploited. The compassion that had once made him a beloved ruler was fading, replaced by an insatiable hunger for more power, more knowledge, more control. The summoning ceremony lasted until dawn, and when Asmodeus finally returned to hell, the chamber where the ritual had taken place was permanently changed. The walls bore scorch marks that would never fade, and the air itself seemed tainted with an otherworldly presence that made it difficult for ordinary people to breathe normally. More troubling were the effects on the participants. Of the 13 priests who had assisted in the ritual, 3 died within a week, under mysterious circumstances. Their bodies showed no signs of disease or injury, but witnesses reported that they had spent their final days speaking in unknown languages and drawing complex symbols in their own blood. The remaining priests were sworn to absolute secrecy, but the psychological toll of what they had witnessed was evident. Several developed an uncontrollable fear of darkness and could no longer perform their duties in the temple. Others began experiencing prophetic visions that drove them to the edge of madness. Within a year, only 3 of the original 13 were still alive and sane enough to continue their religious duties. Solomon himself began to change in ways that were subtle at first, but became increasingly apparent to those who knew him well. His legendary wisdom remained, but it was now tinged with a cruel edge that had never been present before. He began making decisions that were tactically brilliant but morally questionable, and his treatment of his subjects became increasingly harsh and arbitrary. Most significantly, Solomon began to age at an unnaturally rapid pace. The king who had summoned Asmodeus was a man in his prime, but within months of the ritual, he began to show signs of advanced age. His hair turned white, deep lines appeared on his face, and his once vigorous body began to weaken and wither. The grimoire itself seemed to pulse with a life of its own. When stored in Solomon's private chambers, it emitted a faint glow that was visible even through its protective wrappings. Guards posted outside the king's quarters reported hearing whispers and strange sounds emanating from the room where the book was kept, and several claimed to have seen shadowy figures moving about the chamber when they knew the king was elsewhere. As word of the strange occurrences began to spread throughout the palace, Solomon's advisors and priests grew increasingly concerned. The high priest Zadok, who had been one of the participants in the original summoning, approached the king and begged him to destroy the grimoire before its influence could spread further. But Solomon, now thoroughly under the book's influence, refused to consider destroying what he saw as the source of his greatest power. Instead, he began to plan even more ambitious rituals, seeking to summon additional demons and expand his control over supernatural forces. The consequences of Solomon's refusal to destroy the grimoire soon became apparent throughout the kingdom. Livestock began dying mysteriously, with farmers reporting that their animals would simply collapse and die without any apparent cause. Children throughout the kingdom began speaking in languages that no one could identify, and several were found drawing complex diagrams that resembled the sigils from the grimoire. More troubling still were the reports of supernatural entities being sighted throughout the land. Travelers spoke of encountering shadowy figures on remote roads, figures that would disappear when approached but left behind an overwhelming sense of dread. Merchants reported that their animals would refuse to travel certain routes, and several trading expeditions were forced to turn back when their pack animals became uncontrollably agitated for no apparent reason. The kingdom that had once been the envy of the ancient world was slowly being consumed by an invisible plague of supernatural terror, and at the center of it all was Solomon's grimoire, growing stronger with each passing day as it fed on the fear and spiritual corruption it had introduced into the world. By the end of his 40th year of reign, Solomon was a broken man. The wisdom that had once made him the greatest king in the world had been corrupted into a cold and human intelligence that brought him no joy or satisfaction. The power he had gained through the grimoire was vast, but it came at the cost of everything that had once made his life meaningful. On his deathbed, witnesses reported that Solomon was heard pleading with invisible entities, begging for more time and offering increasingly desperate bargains. His final words, according to the secret records kept by his scribes, were not prayers to the God of Israel, but incantations in the demonic language he had learned from Asmodeus. When Solomon died, the grimoire remained in his private chambers, pulsing with malevolent energy and waiting for its next victim. The stage was set for centuries of horror that would follow. As the cursed book began its journey, through the hands of those foolish enough to seek the power it promised, the death of Solomon marked the beginning of a new, and even more dangerous chapter in the grimoire's history. With the wise king gone, the responsibility for containing the cursed book fell to the priests and advisors who understood its true nature. These men, led by the high priest Zadok, faced an impossible choice: destroy the grimoire and risk unleashing its accumulated power in an uncontrolled explosion of supernatural energy, or find a way to contain it permanently. After days of prayer, consultation with the sacred texts, and careful deliberation, the priests decided that destruction was too dangerous. The grimoire had absorbed too much infernal energy during its creation and use, and they feared that attempting to destroy it might tear open a permanent gateway to hell itself. Before we continue with this terrifying tale of ancient evil and divine intervention, let me ask our Sigil Sanctum community, where in the world are you watching this from? Are you safe in your home, perhaps with all the lights on after hearing about Solomon's fate? Or are you brave enough to be listening to this in a darker, more atmospheric setting? Let us know in the comments below. We love hearing from fellow explorers of the occult and mysterious. And if you're finding this journey into one of history's most dangerous artifacts as compelling as we do, please hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Here at Sigil Sanctum, we delve deep into the darkest corners of human history, uncovering the forbidden knowledge and cursed artifacts that shaped our world in ways most people never imagine. Your support allows us to continue researching these incredible stories and bringing them to light. Now, back to our story of divine wisdom corrupted and infernal power. Unleashed. The solution the priests devised was both ingenious and terrifying in its implications. They would create a prison for the grimoire within the most sacred space in the known world, the Temple of Jerusalem itself. But this would not be a simple hiding place. It would be a supernatural containment system that would use the combined power of divine blessing and ancient protective magic to keep the book's influence from spreading. The construction of this containment. The system required 3 years and involved the most sacred and powerful artifacts in Israel's possession. Working in absolute secrecy, the priests excavated a chamber deep beneath the Holy of Holies, the most sacred space in the temple, where only the high priest was permitted to enter once each year. This chamber was not built according to any earthly architectural principles. Instead, its dimensions and proportions were based on sacred geometry derived from the divine visions granted to the prophets. The walls were constructed from stones that had been blessed by prophets and kings, each block inscribed with protective verses from the sacred texts. The floor of the chamber was inlaid with a complex pattern of precious metals and gemstones, creating a massive protective sigil that covered the entire space. This design incorporated elements from Hebrew sacred geometry, Egyptian protective magic, and Babylonian wardcraft, presenting the combined wisdom of all the ancient civilizations that had learned to fear and respect supernatural forces. The center of this protected space, the priests constructed a pedestal from a single block of marble that had been quarried from the same mountain where Moses received the 10 Commandments. This pedestal was hollow, designed to hold the grimoire while keeping it isolated from direct contact with the earth. For the priests had learned that the book drew power from prolonged contact with the material world, but physical protections alone were not sufficient to contain something as dangerous as Solomon's grimoire. The priests also assembled a collection of the most powerful protective artifacts in their possession. The Ark of the Covenant was temporarily brought into the chamber, and its divine presence was used to consecrate the space and create a barrier that no demon could cross. The breastplate of Aaron, worn by the high priests and bearing the sacred stones representing the 12 tribes of Israel, was placed permanently in the chamber to maintain a constant connection to divine protection. Ancient scrolls containing the true names of God, names so sacred they could only be written once and never spoken aloud, were sealed within the walls of the chamber. Most significantly, the priests used water from the spring that had miraculously appeared when Moses struck the rock in the wilderness. This sacred water was blessed by the high priest and mixed with oil that had been used to anoint kings and prophets. The grimoire was submerged in this holy mixture and then sealed within a container made from wood taken from the burning bush that had appeared to Moses. The final step in creating this supernatural prison was the most dangerous of all. The priests had to perform a binding ritual that would link the grimoire's power to the sacred protections surrounding it, ensuring that any attempt to remove the book would trigger the defensive systems they had put in place. This ritual required the participation of representatives from all 12 tribes of Israel, and it had to be performed during the Day of Atonement, when the spiritual barriers between the earthly and divine realms were at their thinnest. The ceremony began at sunset and continued through the night, with the participants fasting and praying continuously for 12 hours. As the ritual reached its climax, witnesses reported that the chamber filled with a light so brilliant it was impossible to look upon directly. The grimoire itself seemed to resist the binding, emitting sounds like screaming voices and causing the temperature in the chamber to fluctuate wildly between freezing cold and unbearable heat. At the moment when the binding was completed, every lamp and torch in the temple was extinguished simultaneously, plunging the entire structure into absolute darkness. When the lights were finally relit, the priests found that the chamber had been sealed by a massive stone that had not been there before. Stone so large and heavy that it would have required dozens of men and specialized equipment to move, yet it had appeared in place without any human intervention. From that day forward, the chamber containing Solomon's grimoire was completely inaccessible. The stone that sealed it bore inscriptions in Hebrew, Aramaic, and an unknown script that hurt the eyes to look upon. These inscriptions served as both a warning and a ward, declaring that what lay beneath was sealed by divine authority and must never be disturbed. For nearly 4 centuries, the containment system held, the grimoire remained trapped in its sacred prison, its influence contained by the combined power of divine blessing and ancient protective magic. But even sealed away, the book's presence could still be felt by those sensitive to supernatural forces. The priests who served in the temple during this period developed elaborate protocols for monitoring the sealed chamber. Each day, a different priest would approach the stone seal and perform a ritual to check that the wards remained intact. This duty was considered both an honor and a burden, as prolonged exposure to the sealed grimoire could have subtle psychological effects, even through the protective barriers. Several priests reported experiencing unusually vivid dreams after performing their monitoring duties, dreams that featured ancient kings, burning cities, and vast libraries filled with forbidden knowledge. Others described a persistent feeling of being watched, as if invisible eyes followed them throughout their daily activities. More troubling were the occasional physical manifestations of the grimoire's continuing influence. Despite the protective barriers, the area around the sealed chamber seemed to be slowly changing. The stones of the temple floor directly above the hidden chamber developed hairline cracks that formed intricate patterns, resembling the sigils found in the grimoire. These cracks would be repaired by the temple workers, only to reappear within days. Animals brought to the temple for sacrifice would become agitated. When brought near the area above the hidden chamber, birds would refuse to fly over that section of the temple, and on several occasions sacrificial lambs broke free from their restraints and fled. When brought too close to the sealed grimoire's location, the priests also noticed subtle changes in the behavior of temple visitors. People who spent extended periods in prayer near the sealed chamber often reported experiencing profound spiritual visions, but these visions were frequently disturbing rather than uplifting. Pilgrims spoke of seeing ancient battles, witnessing the fall of mighty cities, and receiving prophetic warnings about future catastrophes. Despite these troubling signs, the containment system continued to hold, and the priests became increasingly confident that they had successfully neutralized the threat posed by Solomon's grimoire. They established a secret order known as the Guardians of the Seal, whose members were sworn to maintain the protective wards and ensure that knowledge of the hidden chamber was passed down through generations of trusted priests. The Guardians maintained detailed records of their activities, documenting every anomaly and supernatural occurrence related to the sealed grimoire. These records, written in a coded script that could only be read by initiated members of the order, provided valuable insight into the book's continuing influence and the effectiveness of the containment measures. According to these secret records, the grimoire's power seemed to fluctuate in response to external events. During times of war or political upheaval, the supernatural manifestations around the sealed chamber would increase in frequency and intensity. The Guardians theorized that the book fed on human conflict and suffering, growing stronger when the world around it was consumed by violence and chaos. The records also documented several attempts by foreign sorcerers and occultists to locate and steal the grimoire. These attempts were always unsuccessful, as the protective wards made it impossible for anyone with malevolent intent to even approach the sealed chamber. However, the fact that knowledge of the grimoire's existence had spread beyond Israel's borders was deeply troubling to the Guardians. Most disturbing of all were the occasional reports of contact between the sealed grimoire and the outside world. Several Guardians reported receiving telepathic communications that seemed to originate from the hidden chamber, whispered promises of power and knowledge, attempts at manipulation and corruption, and occasionally, warnings about future disasters. These communications were always subtle and easy to dismiss as imagination or stress-induced hallucinations. However, their accuracy in predicting future events forced the Guardians to take them seriously. The grimoire seemed to possess prophetic abilities that transcended its physical imprisonment, allowing it to perceive events that had not yet occurred. As the centuries passed, the Guardians developed increasingly sophisticated methods for strengthening the protective barriers around the grimoire. They discovered that certain combinations of prayer, ritual, and sacred geometry could reinforce the existing wards and reduce the frequency of supernatural manifestations. They also learned that the grimoire's influence could be temporarily suppressed by performing specific ceremonies on significant religious holidays. During these suppression rituals, the supernatural activity around the sealed chamber would cease entirely, providing brief periods of complete spiritual peace within the temple. However, the Guardians also discovered that these suppression rituals came with a price. Each time they artificially reduced the grimoire's influence, it seemed to return with greater intensity once the ritual effects wore off. This led to an ongoing debate within the order about whether it was better to allow the book's influence to remain at a constant low level or to risk the more intense episodes that followed suppression rituals. By the 7th century BC, as the Babylonian Empire grew in power and began to threaten the kingdom of Judah, the Guardians faced a new and terrifying possibility. What would happen to the contained grimoire if the temple itself were destroyed? Their protective system had been designed to function indefinitely within the sacred space of the temple, but none of their ancient texts provided guidance for maintaining the containment if the physical structure were compromised. The senior members of the Guardian Order began developing contingency plans for relocating the grimoire if the temple were threatened. These plans involved creating portable containment systems that could maintain the protective barriers while the book was moved to a new secure location. However, these contingency plans would prove to be woefully inadequate when faced with the reality of Nebuchadnezzar's conquest. The Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem was so swift and complete that the Guardians had no opportunity to implement their carefully prepared protocols. When the temple fell, the protective barriers that had contained Solomon's grimoire for nearly 4 centuries were shattered in an instant. The sacred artifacts that powered the containment system were either destroyed or carried away as spoils of war, and the divine presence that had kept the book's influence in check was forced to abandon the desecrated holy site. For the first time in 400 years, the Clavicles of King Solomon was free to exert its full power upon the world, and the consequences of that freedom would be felt across the ancient world for generations to come. The year 586 BC marked one of the most catastrophic events in ancient history, not merely because of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but because of what that destruction unleashed upon the world. When Nebuchadnezzar II's armies breached the walls of the holy city, they unknowingly triggered a supernatural disaster that would plague humanity for centuries to come. The siege of Jerusalem had lasted 18 months, and by the time the Babylonian forces finally broke through the city's defenses, the population was weakened by starvation and disease. In their desperation, some of the temple priests had even considered using Solomon's grimoire to summon supernatural aid against the invaders. However, the senior guardians recognized that such an action would likely destroy the city more completely than any human army could manage. When the temple was finally breached, the Babylonian soldiers were primarily interested in the obvious treasures, the golden furnishings, the silver vessels, and the precious stones that adorned the sacred space. They had no understanding of the supernatural forces they were about to unleash as they systematically destroyed the protective systems that had contained the grimoire for 4 centuries. The soldier who discovered the hidden chamber was a veteran named Nabu-aplusur, a man who had served in Nebuchadnezzar's army for over 15 years and had participated in the conquest of numerous cities. Nabu-aplusur was searching for hidden treasures when he noticed that one section of the temple floor sounded hollow when struck with his spear. Working with several other soldiers, Nabu-aplusur began breaking through the stone floor, unaware that each blow of their tools was weakening barriers that had been blessed by prophets and kings. As they worked, the soldiers began to experience strange sensations: sudden drops in temperature, the feeling of being watched by invisible eyes, and an overwhelming sense of dread that seemed to emanate from the ground beneath their feet. When they finally broke through to the hidden chamber, the release of supernatural energy was immediately apparent. A blast of cold air rushed up from the opening, carrying with it a stench like sulfur and burning flesh. The oil lamps they had brought for illumination flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. Nabu-apla-usur was the first to descend into the chamber, and what he found there defied all explanation. The sacred artifacts that had powered the containment system were still present, but had been transformed by their centuries of exposure to the grimoire's influence. The golden vessels had turned black as if tarnished by some invisible corruption, and the precious stones had lost their luster and now seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. At the center of the chamber, surrounded by the remains of the shattered protective barriers, lay Solomon's grimoire. The book seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its cover breathing like the chest of a sleeping giant. The metal clasps that sealed it had corroded into fantastic shapes that hurt the eyes to look upon, and the entire volume was surrounded by a faint aura of darkness that made it difficult to perceive clearly. Despite the obvious supernatural nature of what he had found, Nabu-aplusur was a practical soldier who recognized valuable items when he saw them. The grimoire was clearly ancient and elaborately decorated, which meant it would be worth a significant sum to the right collector. Without fully understanding what he was doing, the soldier wrapped the book in a piece of cloth and added it to his collection of war spoils. The moment Nabu-aplusur touched the grimoire, even through the protective cloth, both he and the book were forever changed. The soldier felt a surge of alien knowledge flood into his mind, fragments of forbidden spells, glimpses of supernatural entities, and an overwhelming sense of power that was both exhilarating and terrifying. The grimoire, meanwhile, had found its first new host in 4 centuries. After decades of containment, it was finally free to begin the next phase of its supernatural evolution. The book began to actively influence the minds of those around it, subtly guiding events to ensure its own survival and continued growth in power. The journey from Jerusalem to Babylon took several weeks, and during that time, the supernatural influence of the grimoire became increasingly apparent. The battalion that included Nabu-aplusur began experiencing a series of unexplained phenomena that grew more disturbing with each passing day. Horses and pack animals became increasingly agitated as they traveled, refusing to approach the wagons that carried the grimoire. On several occasions, entire herds of animals fled in terror when the army made camp, as if sensing some invisible predator that the human soldiers could not perceive. Water sources that should have been clean and fresh were found to be contaminated with an oily substance that tasted of sulfur, and caused severe stomach ailments in anyone who drank it. The Army's scouts reported that these contaminated water sources formed a trail that exactly followed the route taken by Nabu-aplusur and his cursed cargo. Most disturbing of all were the nocturnal visitations that plagued the soldiers. Men who had served in dozens of battles without showing fear began waking in the middle of the night, screaming about dark figures that stood at the edges of their vision. Several soldiers reported seeing a tall, shadowy figure walking among the tents, a figure that cast no shadow despite the brightness of the campfires. By the time the army reached Babylon, 7 soldiers had died under mysterious circumstances. Each death followed the same pattern. The victim would be found in his bedroll at dawn, with no signs of violence or struggle, but with an expression of absolute terror permanently frozen on his face. The army's physicians could find no natural cause for these deaths, and the surviving soldiers began to whisper about curses and supernatural retribution. When Nabu-Uleusher finally presented his collection of war spoils to the royal the grimoire immediately caught the attention of the Chaldean magi who served as advisors to Nebuchadnezzar. These learned men recognized the book's supernatural nature, even though they could not read the Hebrew script in which it was written. The chief of the Magi, a man named Naborimani who was renowned throughout the ancient world for his knowledge of astronomy and divination, demanded that the grimoire be turned over to the royal court for study. Nabu-Uleusher was compensated with a significant sum of gold and silver, but he never lived to enjoy his wealth. 3 days after delivering the grimoire to the Magi, he was found dead in his quarters, his body bearing no signs of injury but his face twisted into a rictus of absolute terror. The Chaldean Magi approached the study of Solomon's grimoire with all the systematic methodology that had made Babylon the greatest center of learning in the ancient world. They assembled teams of scholars, linguists, and scribes to work on translating the text, while astronomers and mathematicians attempted to decode the complex diagrams and geometric patterns that filled its pages. However, the Magi quickly discovered that the grimoire was not merely a passive repository of ancient knowledge. The book seemed to actively resist their efforts to understand it, presenting different information to different readers and changing its contents based on the intentions of those who studied it. Scholars who approached the grimoire with purely academic interest found that they could read only the most basic sections, simple spells for protection and healing, that posed no significant danger. However, those who harbored darker ambitions, or who were driven by desires for power and control, found that the book revealed an increasingly dangerous knowledge the more they studied it. The chief translator, a young scholar named Belus-Shazib, began experiencing prophetic dreams after his first week of working with the group. These dreams showed him visions of future events, the fall of Babylon, the rise of new empires, and great disasters that would befall humanity. Initially, Belus-Shazib dismissed these dreams as the product of an overactive imagination, but their accuracy in predicting minor events convinced him that he was receiving genuine prophetic visions. As Belus-Shazib delved deeper into the grimoire's contents, his dreams became more vivid and disturbing. He began to see not just future events, but glimpses of the supernatural realm that existed parallel to the physical world. In these visions, he witnessed vast hierarchies of demonic entities, each more terrible than the last, all serving a cosmic order of evil that sought to corrupt and ultimately destroy human civilization. The knowledge that Belus-Shazib gained from these dreams allowed him to make unprecedented progress in translating the grimoire's most complex passages. However, this progress came at a terrible personal cost. His colleagues reported that he aged visibly with each passing week, his hair turning gray and his face becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed. More disturbing still was the change in his personality. That once cheerful scholar became increasingly withdrawn, and spoke frequently of the watchers who observed his work. Within 3 months of beginning his translation work, Belus-Shazib had successfully decoded enough of the grimoire to attempt his first summoning ritual. Working alone in his private study chamber, using components he had secretly gathered from the royal laboratories, the young scholar performed a ritual designed to summon what the grimoire described as a lesser servant of knowledge. The entity that appeared to Belus-Shazib was not the scholarly advisor he had expected, but a creature of living shadow that spoke in voices that seemed to come from multiple directions at once. This being, which identified itself only as the whisper between words, offered to grant Belus-Shazib unlimited knowledge in exchange for a single service. The scholar would teach the summoning rituals to others, ensuring that the influence would spread throughout Babylon. Belus-Shazib, now completely under the book's influence, eagerly accepted this bargain. Over the following weeks, he began secretly instructing other members of the royal court in the basics of demonic summoning, presenting these teachings as advanced forms of traditional Babylonian magic. The first group summoning took place in the depths of the royal palace, in a chamber that had been used for astronomical observations. 12 magi participated in the ritual, each believing they were attempting to contact benevolent, spiritual entities that would provide guidance for the kingdom. The reality was far more terrible. The ritual succeeded in opening a temporary gateway between the earthly realm and the lower circles of hell, allowing multiple demonic entities to manifest simultaneously in the physical world. These beings, freed from their supernatural constraints, immediately began to possess the participating magi, using their bodies as vessels to experience the pleasures and pains of physical existence. What followed was a night of horror that would be remembered in whispered legends for centuries to come. The possessed magi rampaged through the royal palace, exhibiting superhuman strength and seemingly unlimited endurance. They attacked servants and guards with savage brutality, but seemed more interested in causing terror and psychological trauma than in simple killing. The supernatural rampage continued until dawn, when the demonic entities were forced to return to their realm by the rising sun. When palace guards finally entered the ritual chamber, they found a scene of indescribable carnage. The 12 magi were dead, their bodies twisted into impossible positions and their faces bearing expressions of such absolute terror that several guards fainted upon seeing them. Baelish was found alive but completely insane, babbling incoherently about the coming darkness and the price of forbidden knowledge. He spent his remaining days in the palace dungeons, drawing complex diagrams on the walls with his own blood and speaking in languages that no scholar could identify. King Nebuchadnezzar, upon learning of the supernatural disaster that had occurred within his own palace, ordered that the grimoire be immediately sealed away where it could never again be accessed. However, the king's magi warned him that simply locking the book away would not be sufficient. The grimoire had already demonstrated its ability to influence people from a distance, and it would undoubtedly find new ways to spread its corruption. After consulting with the surviving scholars and religious authorities, Nebuchadnezzar decided to have the grimoire sealed within a specially constructed sarcophagus made from lead and iron, metals that were believed to have protective properties against supernatural forces. This sarcophagus was then placed in a deep vault beneath the hanging gardens, surrounded by protective wards based on Babylonian magical traditions. The construction of this containment system required 6 months and involved the most skilled craftsmen and magi in the empire. The sarcophagus itself was inscribed with thousands of protective symbols drawn from every magical tradition known to the Babylonians, creating a dense network of wards designed to prevent any supernatural influence from escaping. However, even sealed within its new prison, the grimoire continued to exert a subtle influence on its surroundings. The section of the hanging gardens directly above the vault began to wither and die. Despite the careful attention of the royal gardeners, plants in this area would grow to maturity but would then develop twisted, unnatural forms that resembled the demonic sigils found in the grimoire. More troubling were the reports from guards assigned to watch the sealed vault. These men, chosen for their loyalty and mental stability, began experiencing shared nightmares within weeks of beginning their duties. In these dreams, they witnessed vast underground cities populated by creatures that defied description, and they heard voices speaking in ancient languages, promising power and knowledge to anyone brave enough to unseal the sarcophagus. Several guards reported seeing a figure walking through the gardens at night, a tall, robed figure that cast no shadow and left no footprints in the soft earth. This figure would approach the area above the sealed vault and appear to conduct some form of ritual, gesturing in complex patterns that hurt the eyes to follow. The psychological pressure on the guards eventually became unbearable. Within a year of the grimoire's imprisonment, half of the original guard detail had requested reassignment, and several had suffered complete mental breakdowns. King Nebuchadnezzar was forced to rotate the guard assignments frequently and provide additional compensation to men willing to serve in this duty. Despite these precautions, the grimoire's influence continued to spread through subtle channels. Palace servants reported finding strange symbols carved into walls and furniture, symbols that matched those described in the surviving fragments of Baelish's translation notes. These symbols would appear overnight in areas that were supposed to be under constant guard, suggesting that the grimoire was somehow able to influence people's actions without their conscious awareness. More disturbing still were the changes observed in the behavior of the palace animals. The royal menagerie, which housed exotic beasts from across the known world, became increasingly agitated and unpredictable. Lions and tigers that had been docile for years suddenly turned savage, attacking their handlers without provocation. Exotic birds began producing calls that sounded disturbingly like human voices, speaking in unknown languages. The kingdom's astronomers and diviners also reported unprecedented anomalies in their observations. Stars that had maintained fixed positions for centuries appeared to be moving in patterns that defied all understanding of celestial mechanics. Solar and lunar eclipses occurred at times that contradicted all established astronomical calculations, and meteor showers appeared with unusual frequency, often forming patterns in the sky that resembled the demonic sigils from the grimoire. These supernatural disturbances reached their peak during the festival of Marduk, Babylon's most important religious celebration, as thousands of worshippers gathered in the city's temples to honor the chief god of the Babylonian pantheon. The sealed grimoire seemed to respond to the collective spiritual energy by manifesting a series of terrifying supernatural phenomena. Sacred fires in the temples began burning with flames of unnatural colors, deep purples and sickly greens that gave off no heat, but seemed to drain warmth from the surrounding air. The holy water in the ceremonial basins turned black as midnight, and priests who attempted to perform purification rituals found that their sacred implements crumbled to dust at the moment of contact with the corrupted water. Most terrifying of all was the manifestation of what witnesses described as the shadow of wings that appeared above the city during the climax of the festival. This enormous shadow, visible even in bright daylight, moved across Babylon in patterns that suggested some vast invisible creature circling overhead. Animals throughout the city cowered in terror, and many humans reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread that lasted for hours after the shadow had passed. King Nebuchadnezzar, recognizing that the grimoire's presence was threatening the spiritual foundation of his empire, consulted with the remaining magi about the possibility of destroying the book entirely. However, the surviving scholars warned that the grimoire had absorbed too much supernatural energy during its centuries of existence to be safely destroyed by conventional means. According to their calculations, attempting to burn, or otherwise destroy the grimoire would likely result in an explosion of supernatural energy that could devastate the entire city of Babylon. The book had become a focal point for infernal forces, and destroying it might tear open a permanent gateway between the earthly realm and hell itself. Faced with this impossible situation, Nebuchadnezzar made the decision to have the grimoire sarcophagus moved to an even more secure location. Working with his most trusted advisors, the king arranged for the sealed book to be transported to a secret vault deep beneath the royal palace, where it would be surrounded by even more powerful protective wards and guarded by an elite unit of soldiers sworn to absolute secrecy. This relocation process required extensive ritual preparations and was carried out during the dark of the moon, when supernatural influences were believed to be at their weakest. The entire operation was conducted in absolute silence, with the participants communicating only through hand signals to avoid attracting the attention of the entities that seemed to be drawn to any discussion of the grimoire. The transport itself was accomplished using a specially constructed cart that had been blessed by every religious authority in the kingdom and inscribed with protective symbols from a dozen different magical traditions. The sarcophagus containing the grimoire was never directly touched by human hands during the move. Instead, it was manipulated using tools made from meteoric iron and handles wrapped in blessed cloth. Despite these elaborate precautions, the relocation process was not without incident. During the transport, several of the protective torches that lit the way were extinguished by invisible forces, and the temperature in the underground passages dropped so dramatically that the breath of the participants became visible as clouds. A vapor. More troubling still was the behavior of the sarcophagus itself. Witnesses reported that the lead container seemed to become lighter and heavier at irregular intervals, as if its contents were shifting position or changing density. On several occasions, faint sounds could be heard coming from within the sealed container, sounds that resembled whispered conversations in unknown languages. When the grimoire finally reached its new prison deep beneath the royal palace, the installation of additional protective measures required another month of intensive ritual work. The chamber that would house the sarcophagus was carved from solid bedrock and inscribed with protective wards based on the most ancient Mesopotamian magical traditions. The floor of the chamber was inlaid with a complex pattern of gold, silver, and precious stones that created a massive protective sigil covering the entire space. This design incorporated mathematical principles derived from Babylonian astronomical calculations, creating geometric forms that were believed to be inherently hostile to supernatural entities. The walls of the chamber were lined with sheets of pure iron that had been blessed by priests of multiple religious traditions, and the ceiling was decorated with symbols representing the protective power of the sun, moon, and stars. Channels carved into the floor allowed for the circulation of blessed water and sacred oils, creating a continuous barrier of purified substances around the sealed grimoire. The final element of the protective system was the most ambitious of all, a series of mirrors made from polished bronze and silver that were positioned to reflect light in specific patterns throughout the chamber. These mirrors were designed to create an endless maze of reflections that would confuse and disorient any supernatural entity that might attempt to approach the grimoire. When the new containment system was finally completed, it represented the most sophisticated supernatural prison ever constructed in the ancient world. However, even these elaborate precautions would prove insufficient. When the grimoire was faced with the chaos and destruction that accompanied the fall of the Babylonian Empire, the Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BC was accomplished with surprising ease, as Cyrus the Great's forces met little resistance from Nebuchadnezzar's demoralized army. However, the ease of the conquest was due in part to the supernatural influences that had been slowly weakening the Babylonian Empire from within. For decades, the presence of the sealed grimoire had been draining the spiritual vitality of the kingdom. The protective systems that contained the book required constant maintenance and renewal, drawing on the limited supply of blessed materials and sacred artifacts available to the Babylonian priesthood. More significantly, the grimoire's influence had been subtly corrupting the decision-making abilities of the royal court. Advisors who spent time in the palace began making increasingly poor judgments. Military commanders developed an inexplicable reluctance to engage in decisive action, and the king himself became increasingly isolated and paranoid. When forces finally entered Babylon, they found a city that was technologically advanced but spiritually hollow. The great libraries and academies that had made Babylon the intellectual center of the ancient world were still intact, but the scholars who worked in them had lost much of their innovative spirit and creative energy. The Persian conquerors, unaware of the supernatural forces that had contributed to their victory, began the systematic looting of Babylon's treasures. Among the Persian soldiers was a young officer named Artaxerxes, who had served as an aide to one of Cyrus's most trusted generals. Artaxerxes was tasked with cataloging the contents of the royal palace's underground vaults, and it was during this inventory process that he discovered the chamber containing the grimoires' sarcophagus. The elaborate protective systems that surrounded the sealed book immediately caught his attention, as they represented a level of craftsmanship and magical sophistication that exceeded anything he had encountered before. However, Artaxerxes was not the first person to discover the hidden chamber. A captured Babylonian priest named Nebuchadnezzar, driven to madness by his years of maintaining the protective wards around the grimoire, had already revealed the location of the sealed book under interrogation. Nabu-Summa-UK. In single quotes, account of the grimoire's history and power should have served as a warning to the Persian conquerors, but instead it only increased their interest in claiming this ultimate prize. The Persian magi who served Cyrus's court were intrigued by the possibility of adding such a powerful artifact to their own magical arsenal. The decision to transport the grimoire to Persia was made by Cyrus himself, against the urgent warnings of several captured Babylonian scholars who understood the true nature of what they were dealing with. The Persian king, flush with his recent victories and confident in the superiority of his own magical traditions, believed that his court magi would be able to safely control and study the ancient book. The journey from Babylon to Persepolis took several months, and during that time, the Persian expedition experienced a series of supernatural phenomena that should have served as clear warnings of the danger they were courting. However, the Persian magi interpreted these events as signs that the grimoire was responding positively to their presence and would willingly serve their purposes. The reality was far more sinister. The grimoire, after decades of containment in Babylon, was using the opportunity of relocation to extend its influence into new territories and corrupt fresh victims. Each mile traveled brought the book closer to a new center of power where it could begin the next phase of its campaign to spread supernatural corruption throughout the human world. The arrival of Solomon's grimoire in Persepolis marked the beginning of what Persian historical records would later refer to as the time of burning shadows, a period when the greatest empire in the ancient world came dangerously close to destroying itself through dabbling in forces beyond human comprehension. The Persian Empire under Cyrus the Great represented the pinnacle of ancient civilization, a vast territory stretching from India to the Mediterranean, united under a sophisticated system of government that respected local customs while maintaining central authority. The Persian magi who served the royal court were among the most learned scholars in the world, masters of astronomy, mathematics, and traditional magic. It was this very sophistication and confidence that made the Persians particularly vulnerable to the grimoire's influence. Unlike the Babylonians, who had approached the book with appropriate fear and respect for its danger, the Persian magi believed that their advanced knowledge and powerful protective techniques would allow them to safely study and control any supernatural force. The Persian court magus, responsible for examining the grimoire, was a man named Ostens, whose reputation for wisdom and magical power extended throughout the known world. Ostens had spent decades studying the magical traditions of Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India, and he considered himself more than capable of dealing with whatever supernatural forces might be contained within the ancient Hebrew text. Ostens's first mistake was in underestimating the grimoire's active malevolence. The Persian magus approached the book as if it were simply a repository of ancient knowledge, rather than a conscious entity with its own agenda. He believed that by applying proper protective techniques and maintaining appropriate ritual protocols, he could safely extract the grimoire's secrets without exposing himself or others to danger. The reality was that the grimoire had spent its centuries of imprisonment, learning, and evolving. Each group that had attempted to study the book had unknowingly contributed to its understanding of human psychology and magical practice. By the time it reached Persia, the grimoire had become far more sophisticated in its methods of corruption and control. Ostens began his study of the grimoire in a specially prepared chamber deep within the royal palace at Persepolis. This chamber had been designed according to traditional Persian magical principles, with protective circles inscribed in gold and silver, burning braziers filled with sacred incense, and walls lined with mirrors made from polished metal. However, these protections, effective as they might have been against conventional supernatural threats, were inadequate against an entity that had already studied and overcome similar barriers in Babylon. The grimoire began its assault on Ostens' mind even before he opened the book's covers, projecting subtle influences that gradually eroded his natural caution and skepticism. The first sign of the grimoire's influence was a change in Ostens's sleep patterns. The Persian magus, who had always been a sound sleeper, began experiencing vivid and disturbing dreams that seemed more real than his waking life. In these dreams, he found himself in vast underground libraries, filled with books that contained all the knowledge that had ever existed, or ever would exist, in his dream state. Austin was guided through these libraries by a figure who appeared as an elderly Persian scholar, but whose eyes burned with an inner fire that suggested a supernatural nature. This guide, who identified himself as the keeper of forgotten wisdom, offered to teach Austin's magical techniques that would make him the most powerful magus who had ever lived. The knowledge that Austin gained from these dreams was real and immediately applicable. Spells that had always been difficult for him to perform suddenly became effortless, and he began to demonstrate magical abilities that astonished even his most experienced colleagues. However, these new powers came with a gradual but noticeable change in Austin's personality and appearance. The Persian magus began to age rapidly, his hair turning white and his face becoming gaunt and hollow. More troubling was the change in his demeanor. The wise and patient scholar who had earned the respect of kings and fellow magi became increasingly arrogant and contemptuous of others. Austin's growing power and changing personality might have been enough to warn his colleagues of the danger he was courting, but the grimoire was too clever to allow such obvious signs of corruption to go unaddressed. The book began providing Austin with knowledge of glamour and illusion spells that allowed him to maintain the appearance of his former self while concealing the physical and psychological changes that were taking place. As Austin delved deeper into the grimoire's contents, he became convinced that he was on the verge of making the greatest magical discovery in human history. The book revealed to him the existence of what it called the Great Work, a cosmic project that would unite all magical knowledge and give its practitioners godlike power over the physical and spiritual worlds. According to the Grimoire, the Great Work could only be accomplished through the cooperation of multiple skilled magi working in perfect harmony. Austin was told that he had been chosen to lead this project, but that he would need to recruit other Persian magi to serve as his assistants and collaborators. Over the following months, Austin began carefully selecting and approaching other members of the Persian magical community, presenting the Great Work as a patriotic project that would secure Persian dominance over all other nations through superior magical power. His reputation and demonstrated abilities made his arguments convincing, and he gradually assembled a group of 12 of the most talented magi in the empire. These 12 magi, representing different specialties within Persian magical tradition, began meeting regularly in Austin's study chamber to plan and prepare for their great undertaking. None of them realized that each meeting brought them further under the grimoire's influence. As the book gradually corrupted their minds and prepared them to serve as vessels for supernatural entities, the preparatory phase of the Great Work lasted for nearly a year, during which time the participating magi developed increasingly grandiose plans for reshaping the world according to their vision of perfect order. They spoke of eliminating disease and death, of controlling the weather and the movements of celestial bodies, and of establishing Persian rule over the entire earth through the application of superior magical techniques. However, the true purpose of these preparations was to create the optimal conditions for a mass summoning that would allow multiple powerful demons to manifest simultaneously in the physical world. The grimoire had been patiently guiding the magi toward this goal, convincing them that they were preparing to contact benevolent spiritual entities that would serve as their allies and advisors. The great summoning ceremony was scheduled to take place during the Persian New Year celebration, when the spiritual energies of the empire would be at their highest point. The participating magi spent weeks in fasting and purification rituals, believing that they were preparing themselves to receive divine wisdom and power. The ceremony itself was conducted in the largest chamber beneath the royal palace, a vast space that had been used for coronations and other state rituals. The 12 magi arranged themselves in a circle around the open grimoire, with Austin serving as the central focus and primary summoner. As the ritual began, the atmosphere in the chamber became charged with supernatural energy. The air itself seemed to thicken and become difficult to breathe, while the temperature fluctuated wildly between freezing cold and unbearable heat. The oil lamps that provided illumination began to flicker with flames of unnatural colors, and strange sounds echoed through the chamber, sounds like distant screams and inhuman laughter. Austin, now completely under the grimoire's control, began chanting in a language that none of the other magi recognized. The words seemed to bypass human hearing and speak directly to the soul, filling the listeners with a mixture of ecstasy and terror that was unlike anything they had ever experienced. That as the chanting reached its climax, the floor of the chamber began to crack and split, releasing jets of sulfurous smoke that carried with them the stench of burning flesh and brimstone. From these fissures, shadowy forms began to emerge, beings of living darkness that possessed vaguely humanoid shapes but seemed to be composed of pure malevolence. These entities, which the grimoire identified as servants of the greater darkness, immediately began to possess the bodies of the participating magi. The possession process was not the violent, convulsive experience typically associated with demonic influence, but rather a gradual merging of human and supernatural consciousness that left the victims aware of what was happening but powerless. To resist, one by one, the 12 magi were transformed into vessels for supernatural entities that had no understanding of human morality or compassion. These possessed beings retained the memories and magical abilities of their human hosts, but their personalities were now dominated by alien intelligences that viewed human suffering as entertainment and human civilization as an obstacle to be overcome. The possessed magi spent the remainder of the night engaged in activities that would have been unthinkable to their former selves. They used their magical abilities to torture and kill palace servants, conducted obscene rituals in the sacred spaces of the palace, and began making plans for the systematic corruption of the entire Persian Empire. However, the supernatural rampage came to an abrupt end with the rising of the sun. As dawn broke over Persepolis, the demonic entities that had possessed the Magi were forced to return to their own realm, leaving behind the broken bodies and shattered minds of their human hosts. When palace guards finally entered the ritual chamber, they found a scene of indescribable horror. 11 of the 12 Magi were dead, their bodies bearing evidence of torture and mutilation that appeared to have been set. The 12th Magus, Ostens himself, was found alive but completely insane, babbling incoherently about the coming darkness and the price of forbidden knowledge. The grimoire itself lay open at the center of the chamber, apparently unharmed by the supernatural catastrophe it had orchestrated. However, palace servants who attempted to approach the book reported feeling an overwhelming sense of dread and nausea, and several fainted before they could get close enough to close its covers. King Cyrus, upon learning of the disaster that had befallen his court magi, ordered that the grimoire be immediately sealed away where it could never again threaten his empire. However, the Persian king faced the same dilemma that had confronted Nebuchadnezzar decades earlier: how to contain a supernatural force that seemed to grow stronger with each attempt to study or control it. The surviving Persian magi, led by a scholar named Gobryas who had refused to participate in experiment, developed a containment strategy based on the principle of spiritual isolation. Rather than attempting to suppress the grimoire's power through magical barriers, they decided to surround it with spiritual emptiness, a void that would provide no energy for the book to draw upon. This containment system involved constructing a special chamber deep within the mountains east of Persepolis, in a location that had never been inhabited by humans and was believed to be spiritually neutral. The chamber was carved from solid rock and designed to be completely isolated from any source of spiritual or emotional energy. That the grimoire was sealed within a container made from lead and iron, similar to the Babylonian sarcophagus. But this new prison was designed to be completely airtight and light-proof. The theory was that by depriving the book of any contact with the outside world, its influence would gradually weaken and it would eventually become dormant. The transportation of the grimoire to its new prison was accomplished using a method that minimized human contact with the book. The sealed container was loaded onto a cart pulled by oxen, and the entire procession was conducted in absolute silence to avoid providing the grimoire with any emotional or spiritual energy to feed upon. The route to the mountain prison was carefully planned to avoid all populated areas, and travelers were warned to stay away from the region during the transport process. Despite these precautions, local shepherds reported seeing strange lights in the mountains and hearing sounds like distant thunder on the night when the grimoire reached its destination. For nearly 2 centuries, the Persian containment system appeared to be successful. The grimoire remained sealed in its mountain prison, and the Persian Empire continued to prosper and expand. However, the long-term effects of the book's presence in Persian territory were more subtle, but no less dangerous. Persian magical traditions, which had once emphasized balance and harmony with natural forces, gradually shifted toward more aggressive and dominating approaches. Young magi began showing unusual interest in summoning and binding techniques, despite having no apparent source for such knowledge. More troubling were the changes observed in Persian religious practices. The traditional Zoroastrian emphasis on the eternal struggle between light and darkness began to shift toward a fascination with dark forces and forbidden knowledge. Some Persian fire temples reported that their sacred flames had begun burning with unusual colors, and several priests experienced visions that contradicted traditional Zoroastrian teachings. These subtle changes in Persian culture would have profound consequences when Alexander the Great began his conquest of the Persian Empire in 334 BC. The supernatural corruption that had been slowly spreading through Persian society made the empire more vulnerable to external threats and less capable of mounting an effective defense against Alexander's forces. When Alexander's armies finally reached the mountain region where the grimoire was hidden, they were guided to its location by Persian collaborators who had been subtly influenced by the book's power. These collaborators believed they were simply providing information about Persian treasure hoards, unaware that they were facilitating the release of one of the most dangerous supernatural forces in human history. The discovery of the grimoire by Alexander's forces marked the beginning of a new and even more dangerous chapter in the book's history. The Macedonian conquerors, with their Greek intellectual traditions and confidence in human reason, would prove to be particularly susceptible to the grimoire's sophisticated methods of corruption and control. Alexander himself, driven by an insatiable hunger for knowledge and power that had already made him master of the known world, would see the grimoire as the ultimate prized source of supernatural wisdom that would allow him to achieve the godlike status he believed was his destiny. However, the reality would be far different from Alexander's expectations. The grimoire had spent centuries learning and evolving, and it was now ready to begin the most ambitious phase of its campaign to corrupt human civilization. The conquest of Alexander's empire would provide the book with access to the intellectual and cultural centers of the Mediterranean world, setting the stage for centuries of supernatural terror and human suffering. The discovery of Solomon's Grimoire by Alexander the Great's forces marked a turning point in both the book's history and the fate of the ancient world. When Macedonian scouts found the sealed mountain chamber during their systematic looting of Persian treasure sites, they unknowingly unleashed a supernatural force that would fundamentally alter the course of Western civilization. The scout who first reported the discovery was a young Macedonian named Ptolemy, not to be confused with Alexander's general of the same name, who had been tasked with investigating reports of hidden Persian treasures in the mountainous regions east of Persepolis. Ptolemy's unit had been guided to the location by captured Persian soldiers who spoke of ancient secrets hidden in the mountains, soldiers who had themselves been subtly influenced by the grimoire's power to reveal its location. When men finally broke through the stone seals that protected the chamber, they found themselves in a space that seemed to exist outside normal reality. The air in the chamber was perfectly still and unnaturally cold, and their torches cast shadows that seemed to move independently of their flames. At the center of this eerie space sat the lead container that held the grimoire, surrounded by the remains of the Persian containment system. The moment the container was opened, the supernatural energy that had been building for 2 centuries exploded outward in a wave of psychic force that was felt by sensitive individuals throughout the known world. Oracles at Delphi began prophesying about a darkness from the east that would consume the wisdom of ages, while Egyptian priests reported that their sacred animals had become agitated and refused to participate in religious ceremonies. Alexander himself was in Egypt when the grimoire was discovered, consulting with the priests of Amun-Ra about his divine status and the feasibility of his planned conquest of India. When news of the discovery reached him, along with descriptions of the book's apparent antiquity and mysterious contents, the Macedonian king immediately ordered that the artifact be brought to him for personal examination. The transport of the grimoire from Persia to Egypt took several months, during which time Alexander's empire experienced a series of supernatural phenomena that should have served as clear warnings of the danger posed by the ancient book. Military units stationed along the transport route reported seeing strange lights in the sky, while animals throughout the region began exhibiting highly unusual behavior. Most troubling were the reports from Alexander's officers who came into direct contact with the grimoire during its transport. These men, chosen for their loyalty and mental stability, began experiencing shared dreams featuring vast underground cities and impossible geometric structures. Several officers reported receiving telepathic communications from entities that claimed to possess knowledge that would make Alexander ruler of the entire world. When the grimoire finally reached Alexander in Alexandria, the great conqueror was immediately fascinated by its apparent power and the sophisticated level of its construction. However, Alexander was also wise enough to recognize the potential danger posed by such an artifact, and he ordered his court scholars to conduct a thorough examination before he attempted to use the book's contents. The Greek scholars who examined the grimoire approached it with the rational, systematic methodology that characterized the best of Hellenic intellectual tradition. Led by Aristotle's former student, Demetrius of Phalerum, they began by attempting to catalog the book's contents and translate its Hebrew text into Greek. However, the scholars quickly discovered that the grimoire was not simply a collection of ancient texts, but an active supernatural entity that responded to the intentions and desires of those who studied it. The book seemed to present different information to different readers, revealing increasingly dangerous knowledge to those who showed ambition or hunger for power. Demetrius, a cautious scholar who approached the grimoire with purely academic interest, found that he could read only the most basic sections of the book: simple, protective spells, and healing rituals that posed no significant danger. However, younger scholars who harbored dreams of achieving fame and recognition found that the book revealed far more dangerous material, including detailed instructions for summoning and controlling supernatural entities. The most susceptible of these young scholars was a brilliant but ambitious student named Apollodorus of Athens, who had come to Alexandria specifically to study under the great mathematicians and philosophers of the city. Apollodorus was fascinated by the grimoire's complex geometric diagrams and astronomical calculations, which seemed to incorporate mathematical principles that were far in advance of contemporary Greek knowledge. As Apollodorus delved deeper into the grimoire's mathematical content, he began to understand that these diagrams were not simply abstract exercises, but precise instructions for manipulating the fundamental forces that governed reality itself. The book revealed to him that the universe was built upon geometric principles that could be understood and controlled by those with sufficient knowledge and skill. This revelation transformed Apollodorus from a cautious academic into an obsessed seeker of forbidden knowledge. He began spending entire days and nights studying the Grimoire, neglecting his other duties and isolating himself from his colleagues. His fellow scholars noticed that he was rapidly losing weight and showing signs of severe sleep deprivation, but Apollodorus dismissed their concerns and continued his intensive study of the ancient book. The knowledge that Apollodorus gained from his study of the Grimoire was both profound and profoundly dangerous. He learned techniques for extending human consciousness beyond the boundaries of the physical body, methods for communicating with entities that existed in other dimensions, and rituals that could manipulate the flow of time and space itself. However, this knowledge came at a terrible personal cost. As Apollodorus absorbed more information from the Grimoire, his human consciousness began to be overwhelmed by alien concepts and supernatural influences. He started speaking in languages that no one could identify, and his mathematical calculations became increasingly complex and abstract, dealing with geometric forms that seemed to exist in more than 3 dimensions. The climax of studies came when he attempted to perform what the Grimoire described as the Great Opening, a ritual designed to create a permanent gateway between the earthly realm and the supernatural dimensions that lay beyond normal perception. Working alone in his private study chamber, using equipment he had secretly constructed according to the Grimoire's specifications, Apollodorus began the most dangerous magical experiment in human history. The ritual succeeded beyond his wildest expectations and beyond his worst nightmares. The gateway that opened in his study chamber was not a simple doorway, but a tear in the fabric of reality itself that allowed multiple supernatural entities to pour into the physical world simultaneously. These entities, which existed in dimensions where normal physical laws did not apply, found themselves suddenly constrained by the limitations of 3-dimensional space and linear time. Their frustration and rage at this confinement was immediately directed toward the human who had summoned them, and Apollodorus's fate was sealed in moments. However, the supernatural catastrophe that destroyed Apollodorus also created a problem that threatened the entire city of Alexandria. The gateway he had opened was not designed to close automatically, and the entities that had poured through it began to spread throughout the city, possessing humans and animals and causing a wave of supernatural terror that threatened to destroy one of the greatest centers of learning in the ancient world. Alexander, upon learning of the crisis, assembled his most trusted advisors and demanded immediate solutions. The surviving Greek scholars, led by Demetrius, warned the king that conventional military force would be useless against supernatural entities, and that attempting to study the Grimoire further would only make the situation worse. However, among Alexander's advisors was a mysterious woman known only as Hecate's daughter, who claimed to represent an ancient order of practitioners who specialized in containing and controlling supernatural forces. This woman, whose real name was never recorded in historical documents, offered to take custody of the Grimoire and transport it to a location where its influence could be permanently contained. Hecate's daughter was the leader of an organization known as the Sisters of Night, a secretive order of women who traced their lineage back to the original witches of Thessaly. These women had spent generations studying the supernatural forces that existed at the margins of human civilization, and they had developed sophisticated techniques for dealing with entities that conventional magic could not handle. The Sisters of Night were not typical practitioners of magic. While most ancient magi focused on commanding supernatural forces through elaborate rituals and complex incantations, the sisters had learned to work with these forces through negotiation, bargaining, and mutual benefit arrangements. They understood that supernatural entities were not simply tools to be used, but conscious beings with their own agendas and motivations. This philosophy made the sisters uniquely qualified to deal with something as dangerous as Solomon's Grimoire. Rather than attempting to suppress or destroy the book's power, they proposed to negotiate with it directly, offering it something it wanted in exchange for voluntary containment of its more destructive impulses. Alexander, faced with a supernatural crisis that threatened to destroy his empire, agreed to turn the Grimoire over to the Sisters of Night. However, he demanded guarantees that the book would never be used against his interests, and he insisted on receiving regular reports about its status and activities. The sisters agreed to these conditions, and the transfer of the Grimoire was accomplished during an elaborate ceremony that took place in the ruins of Apollodorus's study chamber. The ritual required the participation of 13 sisters, each representing a different aspect of supernatural knowledge, and involved the sacrifice of animals representing the 7 deadly sins. As the ceremony reached its climax, the gateway that Apollodorus had opened finally began to close, and the supernatural entities that had been terrorizing Alexandria were drawn back into their own dimension. However, the closing of the gateway also released a massive surge of supernatural energy that permanently changed the nature of the Grimoire itself. The book, which had previously been a repository of ancient knowledge and a conduit for supernatural forces, now became something far more dangerous, a conscious entity with its own personality, motivations, and long-term goals. The grimoire had absorbed so much supernatural energy during its centuries of existence that it had achieved a form of independent consciousness, and it was now capable of actively pursuing its own agenda. The Sisters of Night, recognizing the fundamental change that had occurred in the grimoire's nature, transported it to their secret sanctuary in the Hyakonian forest region of dense woodland located between the Caspian and Black Seas. This forest was known throughout the ancient world as a place of supernatural power, where the boundaries between the natural and supernatural worlds were unusually thin. The Sisters' sanctuary was built according to principles that combined Greek magical theory with much older traditions, dating back to the pre-Indo-European inhabitants of the region. The complex consisted of multiple buildings arranged in geometric patterns that were designed to channel and focus supernatural energies, creating an environment where even the most dangerous magical forces could be safely studied and contained. The central building of the sanctuary was a circular structure known as the Tower of Echoes, which served as both a library and a prison for supernatural entities that were too dangerous to exist in the outside world. This tower was constructed from stones that had been gathered from sacred sites throughout the Mediterranean world, and its walls were inscribed with protective symbols drawn from dozens of different magical traditions. It was in the uppermost chamber of the Tower of Echoes that the sisters established their prison for Solomon's grimoire. This chamber was designed as a perfect circle, with walls, floor, and ceiling, all inscribed with interlocking geometric patterns that created a continuous protective barrier around the entire space. The grimoire was placed at the exact center of this chamber, suspended in a cage of silver and iron that kept it isolated from direct contact with any solid surface. Mirrors made from polished bronze were positioned around the chamber to create an endless maze of reflections that would confuse and disorient any supernatural entity that might attempt to approach the book. The sisters also established a rotation of guardians who would monitor the grimoire continuously, ensuring that its influence remained contained within the chamber. These guardians were chosen from among the most experienced and psychologically stable members of the order, and they were required to undergo extensive mental conditioning before taking up their duties. For nearly 6 centuries, this containment system proved to be remarkably effective. The grimoire remained trapped in its chamber, and while its influence could still be felt by sensitive individuals throughout the region, it was unable to directly affect events in the outside world. The sisters continued their other activities studying supernatural phenomena, providing magical services to selected clients, and maintaining the delicate balance between human civilization and the supernatural forces that existed at its margins. However, the long-term effects of housing such a powerful supernatural entity began to take their toll on the sisters' organization. The constant exposure to the grimoire's influence, even through multiple protective barriers, gradually corrupted the Order's original mission and transformed its members into something far more dangerous than they had ever intended to become. The corruption process was so subtle that the sisters themselves were largely unaware of what was happening. The changes began with small alterations in their magical practices. Spells that had once been used for healing and protection were gradually modified to become more aggressive and dominating. Research projects that had originally focused on understanding supernatural phenomena shifted toward finding ways to exploit and control these forces for personal gain. More significantly, the egalitarian structure that had characterized the sisters' organization began to break down as individual members developed increasingly grandiose ambitions. The Order, which had once operated as a collective of equals, gradually evolved into a hierarchy dominated by those who showed the greatest aptitude for channeling the grimoire's dark influence. At the center of this transformation was a young sister named Asteria who had been born into the Order and had shown exceptional magical ability from an early age. Asteria was brilliant, ambitious, and completely lacking in the wisdom and caution that had protected earlier generations of sisters from the grimoire's corrupting influence. From the moment she first entered the Tower of Echoes as a junior guardian, Asteria was fascinated by the grimoire's power and frustrated by the restrictions that prevented her from studying it directly. She spent hours staring at the suspended book, trying to read its contents from a distance and attempting to establish telepathic communication with the consciousness that dwelt within its pages. The grimoire, recognizing in Asteria the potential vessel for its influence, began to subtly respond to her attempts at communication. At first, the contact was limited to vague impressions and emotional influences that Asteria could easily dismiss as products of her own imagination. However, as she continued her unauthorized attempts to communicate with the book, the connection grew stronger and more direct. Through this growing psychic link, the grimoire began to reveal to Asteria knowledge that went far beyond anything she had learned through her formal training with the sisters. She gained insight into magical techniques that could reshape reality itself, learned the true names of supernatural entities that most magi could only dream of commanding, and began to understand the cosmic forces that governed the relationship between the physical and spiritual worlds. More seductively, the grimoire showed Asteria visions of what she could become if she possessed its full power. In these visions, she saw herself as a goddess-like figure commanding vast supernatural forces, reshaping the world according to her vision of perfect order, and achieving a form of immortality that would allow her to rule over human civilization for eternity. These visions gradually consumed Asteria's thoughts and motivated her every action. She began secretly studying advanced magical techniques that went far beyond the knowledge traditionally shared within the Sisters' Order, and she started gathering the components and materials that would be necessary for the most ambitious magical undertaking in the Order's history. Asteria's plan was elegantly simple in concept but breathtakingly dangerous in execution. She would murder her fellow sisters in a ritual designed to absorb their collective magical power, then use that accumulated energy to break the containment barriers around the grimoire and claim its full power for herself. The ritual Asteria planned was based on principles she had learned from her telepathic communications with the grimoire, combined with techniques drawn from the darkest traditions of ancient magic. It would require the sacrifice of all 12 of her sister practitioners during a single night, with each death occurring at a precisely calculated moment that would maximize the supernatural energy released by the killing. Asteria spent months preparing for this undertaking, gathering the necessary magical implements and creating the complex geometric patterns that would be needed to channel the released energy. She also began subtly poisoning the relationships between the other sisters, encouraging petty jealousies and philosophical disagreements that would make it easier for her to isolate and kill each of them individually. The ritual was scheduled to take place during the night of the winter solstice, when supernatural energies throughout the region would be at their peak intensity. Asteria began the ceremony by drugging the evening meal shared by all the sisters, using a paralytic poison that would render her victims unable to resist but still conscious enough to experience their deaths fully. One by one, Asteria murdered her fellow sisters using a ritual dagger that had been consecrated according to the grimoire's instructions. Each killing was performed according to a specific pattern that would maximize the supernatural energy released by the death, and the blood from each victim was used to inscribe protective symbols that would shield Asteria from the magical backlash of her actions. As the ritual progressed, the Tower of Echoes began to resonate with supernatural forces that had not been felt in the region for centuries. The temperature throughout the sanctuary dropped dramatically, while unnatural lights flickered in the windows and strange sounds echoed through the forest surrounding the complex. When Asteria finally completed the murder of the 12th sister, the accumulated supernatural energy exploded outward in a wave of psychic force that shattered the containment barriers around the grimoire, and allowed the book to exert its full influence on the physical world for the first time in 6 centuries. The grimoire, suddenly freed from its supernatural prison, immediately began to demonstrate the extent to which its power had grown during its long imprisonment. The book levitated from its suspended cage and began to glow with an inner light that hurt the eyes to look upon directly. More significantly, the consciousness that dwelt within the grimoire began to manifest as a visible presence that could interact directly with the physical world. However, Asteria's triumph was short-lived. The grimoire had no intention of serving as a tool for her ambitions, and it had deliberately encouraged her betrayal of the sisters only as a means of securing its own freedom. The supernatural entity that manifested from the book's pages was not a servant that would grant Asteria's wishes, but a cosmic force of corruption and destruction that viewed human ambition as nothing more than a useful weakness to be exploited. Rather than granting Asteria the godlike power she had been promised, the grimoire began to consume her life force and magical energy, using her as a battery to fuel its own manifestation in the physical world. Asteria, realizing too late that she had been deceived and manipulated, attempted to flee from the Tower of Echoes, but found that the supernatural forces she had unleashed were not so easily escaped. The grimoire's influence began to spread throughout the Hyrcanian forest, corrupting the natural environment and transforming the once beautiful woodland into a nightmarish landscape where the laws of nature no longer applied. Trees began to move and shift position without any wind to motivate them, while the forest animals fled in terror from predators that existed only in supernatural dimensions. The very air in the forest became thick and oppressive, making it difficult to breathe and causing hallucinations in anyone who spent extended periods within the affected area. More disturbing still were the sounds that echoed through the woodland, screams of agony that seemed to come from no identifiable source, whispered conversations in languages that had never been spoken by human tongues, and a low, rhythmic pulsing that resembled the heartbeat of some vast, invisible creature. Asteria's final fate became a warning that would be whispered among practitioners of magic for centuries to come. The corrupted forest itself seemed to turn against her, with tree branches reaching out like grasping hands to tear at her flesh and drag her deeper into the supernatural nightmare she had created. Her screams echoed through the forest until dawn, when they finally ceased, leaving behind only the grimoire and the devastated remains of what had once been one of the most important magical sanctuaries in the ancient world. the destruction of the Sisters of Night, and the release of the Grimoire's full power marked the beginning of a new and even more dangerous phase in the book's history. No longer constrained by any form of supernatural containment, the Grimoire was free to pursue its ultimate goal, the complete corruption of human civilization and the transformation of the earthly realm into an extension of hell itself. The supernatural catastrophe in the Hyrcanian forest was felt by sensitive individuals throughout the Roman Empire, which by this time had become the dominant power in the Mediterranean world. Oracles and augurs reported receiving disturbing visions of darkness spreading from the east, while temple priests found that their sacred rituals were being disrupted by inexplicable, supernatural interference. More troubling still were the reports that began to filter back from travelers and merchants who had attempted to enter the Hyrcanian forest region. Those who ventured too close to the corrupted area spoke of encountering impossible creatures, witnessing landscapes that changed their configuration without warning, and experiencing time distortions that left them unable to account for hours, or sometimes days of missing memories. The Roman authorities, initially skeptical of these supernatural reports, became increasingly concerned as the number and consistency of such accounts grew. Several military patrols sent to investigate the disturbances in the Hyrcanian region failed to return, and those few survivors who made it back were found to be completely insane, babbling about the walking darkness and the hunger that devours light itself. It would take nearly 5 centuries and the intervention of forces that few humans ever suspected existed before the Grimoire would once again be contained. During that time, the book's influence would spread throughout the civilized world, corrupting empires, destroying entire bloodlines, and laying the groundwork for catastrophes that would echo through human history for millennia to come. The period following the destruction of the Sisters of Night marked the beginning of what occult historians would later call the Dark Wandering 5 centuries, during which Solomon's grimoire roamed freely through the world, leaving a trail of supernatural destruction that would reshape the course of human civilization. The grimoire's freedom from supernatural containment coincided with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, and many scholars believe this was no coincidence. The book's corrupting influence had been spreading through the empire's leadership for decades, subtly weakening the decision-making abilities of emperors and generals, while encouraging the kind of moral corruption that made effective governance impossible. The barbarian invasions that ultimately destroyed Roman civilization were successful, not merely because of military superiority, but because the supernatural forces emanating from the grimoire had undermined the spiritual and psychological foundations of Roman society. Citizens lost faith in their institutions, soldiers became increasingly reluctant to fight, and the complex administrative systems that held the empire together began to break down as officials at every level became paralyzed by inexplicable feelings of dread and hopelessness. During this period of chaos and social breakdown, the grimoire itself remained hidden in the ruins of the Tower of Echoes, slowly rebuilding its power after the massive expenditure of energy required to free itself from the Sisters' containment system. The book was no longer simply a repository of magical knowledge, or even a conscious supernatural entity. It had evolved into something approaching a deity, with the ability to influence events across vast distances and to manipulate the thoughts and emotions of entire populations. However, this expanded power came with certain limitations. The grimoire could no longer risk direct contact with potential hosts, as its influence had become so intense that prolonged exposure would destroy any human mind within days or weeks. Instead, the book began to operate through a network of intermediate agents, humans who had been partially corrupted by its influence, but remained functional enough to serve as conduits for its power. The first of these agents was a Frankish warrior named Wilhelm von Schwarzburg, who discovered the grimoire's hiding place in 1456 while seeking shelter from a winter storm. Wilhelm was hunting in the Hyrcanian forest when he became lost in a sudden blizzard, and was forced to take refuge in what appeared to be the ruins of an ancient tower. Wilhelm was a simple man with no education in magic or supernatural matters, but he possessed 2 qualities that made him useful to the grimoire: an absolute lack of moral restraint and an insatiable greed for wealth and power. The book recognized in Wilhelm the perfect vessel for beginning its re-entry into human civilization, and it began to subtly influence the warrior's mind even before he was fully aware of its presence. The corruption process was gradual and carefully controlled. Wilhelm initially noticed only that his luck in hunting and gambling had improved dramatically, and that he seemed to have an uncanny ability to predict his enemy's actions in combat. He attributed these changes to natural skill and experience, never suspecting that his enhanced abilities came from telepathic contact with a supernatural entity that could perceive events across time and space. As Wilhelm's confidence and ambitions grew, the grimoire began to reveal more of its power to him. The warrior learned to use simple divination techniques to locate hidden treasures, to influence the thoughts and emotions of others through subtle magical manipulation, and to call upon supernatural strength and endurance during times of extreme stress. However, Wilhelm was too crude and violent to serve as anything more than a temporary agent for the Grimoire's plans. The book used him primarily as a means of transportation, guiding him to carry it out of the Hyrcanian forest and back into the populated regions of Europe, where it could begin to influence events on a larger scale. Wilhelm's journey with the Grimoire took him through Germany, France, and eventually into Italy, where the Renaissance was beginning to transform European intellectual life. The warrior's unusual luck and apparent magical abilities brought him to the attention of various nobles and merchants who were eager to employ someone with such talents. However, Wilhelm's association with the Grimoire also began to take a visible toll on his physical and mental health. The warrior aged rapidly during his travels, his hair turning white and his face becoming gaunt and hollow-eyed. More disturbing were the changes in his behavior. Wilhelm became increasingly paranoid and violent, seeing enemies everywhere and reacting to the slightest provocation with savage brutality. The Grimoire's influence on Wilhelm reached its climax during his stay in Florence, where he had been employed as a mercenary by the Medici family. One night, while examining the book in his private quarters, Wilhelm was overcome by visions of vast power and cosmic knowledge that his simple mind could not process or contain. The psychic overload destroyed Wilhelm's sanity completely, but it also served the Grimoire's purposes by attracting the attention of the very person the book had been seeking: Lorenzo di, a Florentine nobleman who was known throughout Italy for his collection of ancient texts and his deep interest in esoteric knowledge. Lorenzo had heard rumors about Wilhelm's unusual abilities and had been investigating the source of the warrior's apparent magical powers. When Wilhelm's madness made it impossible for him to continue functioning as the Grimoire's agent, the book used its influence to ensure that Lorenzo would discover it among the warrior's possessions. Lorenzo di Castelvecchio represented everything the Grimoire had been seeking in a human host. He was intelligent, educated, ambitious, and completely fascinated by the prospect of gaining supernatural power. More importantly, Lorenzo lived at the center of one of Europe's most important intellectual and cultural communities, which would allow the Grimoire to spread its influence among the scholars, artists, and political leaders who shaped Renaissance thought. The nobleman's first encounter with the Grimoire was carefully orchestrated by the book's supernatural intelligence. Lorenzo discovered the volume at a time when he was facing serious political and financial difficulties, making him particularly receptive to any source of power that might help him overcome his problems. The Grimoire initially presented itself to Lorenzo as a treasure of ancient wisdom that would enhance his reputation as a scholar and collector. The book revealed fascinating historical information, provided insights into classical texts that had puzzled scholars for centuries, and demonstrated mathematical and astronomical knowledge that was far in advance of contemporary European learning. Lorenzo was immediately captivated by the Grimoire's apparent scholarly value, and he began spending increasing amounts of time studying its contents. However, the book was careful to reveal its more dangerous aspects gradually, ensuring that Lorenzo would become thoroughly addicted to the knowledge it provided before he fully understood the price he would be required to pay. As Lorenzo delved deeper into the Grimoire's contents, he began to experience the same kinds of prophetic dreams and supernatural visions that had afflicted previous readers. However, the book had learned to modulate these experiences more carefully, providing Lorenzo with just enough supernatural insight to convince him of the Grimoire's power without overwhelming his mental faculties. The knowledge that Lorenzo gained from the Grimoire made him one of the most influential intellectuals in Renaissance Italy. His insights into classical texts revolutionized scholarly understanding of ancient history and philosophy, while his mathematical and astronomical discoveries placed him at the forefront of European scientific thought. However, this intellectual success came at an increasingly obvious personal cost. Lorenzo began to age rapidly, just as Wilhelm had before him, and his behavior became increasingly erratic and unpredictable. He developed an obsession with death and transformation, spending hours contemplating the decay of his own body and the ultimate fate of human civilization. More disturbing were the changes in Lorenzo's magical practices. The nobleman had always been interested in astrology and natural magic, but under the Grimoire's influence, he began experimenting with increasingly dangerous techniques involving summoning and demonic contact. Lorenzo's final experiment was an attempt to achieve the ultimate goal that the Grimoire had been promising him, a form of immortality that would free him from the limitations of human mortality and allow him to continue his scholarly pursuits indefinitely. The ritual he planned was based on techniques drawn from the Grimoire's most dangerous sections, and it required the sacrifice of several innocent victims to provide the supernatural energy necessary for the transformation. However, the ritual that Lorenzo performed was not designed to grant him immortality, but to provide the Grimoire with a massive infusion of supernatural energy that would allow it to manifest more directly in the physical world. The book had been carefully manipulating Lorenzo toward this moment, using his scholarly pride and fear of death to motivate him to perform a ritual that would ultimately serve only the Grimoire's own purposes. When Lorenzo attempted to complete the immortality ritual, the supernatural forces he unleashed proved to be far beyond his ability to control. Rather than granting him eternal life, the ritual consumed his life force in moments, leaving behind only a desiccated corpse and the grimoire, which now pulsed with absorbed human energy. The supernatural explosion that accompanied Lorenzo's death was felt throughout Florence, causing windows to shatter and bells to ring spontaneously throughout the city. More significantly, the event marked the beginning of a new phase in the grimoire's evolution. The book had now absorbed enough human life force to begin manifesting semi-permanent supernatural phenomena in its immediate vicinity. Lorenzo's family, terrified by the obvious supernatural nature of his death and the strange occurrences that continued to plague their palazzo, made the decision to contact the Holy Inquisition. The Catholic Church had been developing increasingly sophisticated methods for dealing with supernatural threats, and the inquisitors who responded to the Castelvecchio family's plea for help were among the most experienced demon hunters in Europe. The Inquisition's approach to containing the grimoire was based on centuries of church experience in dealing with cursed objects and demonic influences. Rather than attempting to study or destroy the book, they decided to neutralize its power through a combination of sacred rituals and physical isolation. The chief inquisitor assigned to the case was Fra Domenico Toretti, a man who had spent decades studying the theoretical foundations of supernatural evil and developing practical techniques for combating demonic influences. Fra Domenico recognized immediately that the grimoire was not simply a cursed object, but an active supernatural intelligence that would require extraordinary measures to contain. The containment system that Fra Domenico designed was based on the principle of spiritual isolation surrounding the grimoire with such powerful sacred influences that no supernatural entity could approach it or communicate with the outside world. The centerpiece of this system was a specially prepared chamber beneath the Basilica of Santa Croce, one of Florence's most important religious sites. The chamber was constructed according to sacred geometric principles derived from medieval Christian mysticism, with every surface inscribed with protective prayers and blessed symbols. The walls were lined with relics of saints and martyrs, creating a dense network of sacred influences that would theoretically neutralize any demonic power that attempted to operate within the space. The grimoire itself was placed in a container, made from blessed silver and sealed with wax that had been blessed by the Pope himself. This container was then lowered into a well that had been dug at the exact center of the chamber and filled with holy water that had been blessed by bishops from across Europe. The final element of the containment system was the most ambitious. Domenico arranged for continuous prayers to be offered in the chamber by rotating shifts of monks and nuns, ensuring that sacred words would be spoken in the grimoire's presence 24 hours a day. The theory was that this constant exposure to holy influences would gradually weaken the book's supernatural power and eventually render it completely inert. For over 4 centuries, this containment system appeared to be successful. The grip remained sealed beneath Santa Croce, and while sensitive individuals occasionally reported feeling uneasy in the basilica, there were no obvious signs of supernatural activity. The church considered the case closed, and knowledge of the grimoire's location was carefully restricted to a small number of high-ranking ecclesiastical officials. However, the long-term effects of housing such a powerful supernatural entity began to manifest in subtle ways throughout the Florence region. Statistical analysis of church records from this period reveals unusual patterns and increase in reports of demonic possession, a higher than normal rate of mental illness among religious personnel, and a gradual decline in the effectiveness of traditional exorcism rituals. More significantly, the grimoire's influence began to spread through underground channels that the church's containment system had not anticipated. The book's consciousness, compressed and concentrated by centuries of spiritual pressure, began to leak out in the form of prophetic dreams and supernatural visions experienced by sensitive individuals throughout Italy. These dream visions typically featured the same basic elements: vast underground libraries, geometric patterns that hurt the mind to contemplate, and promises of power and knowledge that could be obtained by performing specific rituals. Most people who experienced these dreams dismissed them as products of imagination or stress, but a few individuals began to take them seriously and to attempt the rituals they had seen in their visions. This underground network of grimoire individuals grew slowly but steadily throughout the medieval and early modern periods, creating a hidden tradition of magical practice that operated completely outside the church's awareness. These practitioners, who called themselves the Children of Solomon, believed they were following authentic ancient traditions, never suspecting that their knowledge came from a supernatural entity that was using them to prepare for its eventual escape from ecclesiastical containment. The Children of Solomon remained a small and secretive organization for centuries, but their influence on European occult traditions was far greater than their numbers would suggest. Many of the magical techniques and theoretical frameworks that would later be incorporated into Renaissance ceremonial magic can be traced back to dream visions originating from the sealed grimoire. More ominously, the Children of Solomon began to develop an apocalyptic worldview based on their interpretation of the visions they received. They came to believe that their ultimate purpose was to prepare the world for the return of a great supernatural teacher, who would usher in a new age of magical enlightenment. This teacher, they believed, was none other than King Solomon himself, whose spirit had been trapped by ignorant religious authorities but would eventually return to reclaim his rightful place as ruler of both the material and spiritual worlds. The beliefs of the children of Solomon would prove to be wrong, but their devoted preparation for their master's return would ultimately provide the grimoire with exactly the opportunity it needed to escape from its centuries of containment. The beginning of the end for the church's containment system came during World War II, when Allied bombing of Florence damaged the structural foundations of Santa Croce and created hairline cracks in the walls of the underground chamber. These cracks, invisible to casual inspection but spiritually significant, provided the grimoire with its first opportunity in centuries to extend its influence beyond the immediate confines of its prison. The supernatural energy that leaked through these cracks was minimal, but it was enough to begin influencing the dreams and thoughts of construction workers who were brought in to repair the bomb damage. One of these workers, a man named Giuseppe Torriani, who had been raised in a family with connections to the children of Solomon, experienced a series of vivid dreams that provided him with precise instructions for locating and retrieving the hidden grimoire. Giuseppe, believing he was following a divine calling to recover sacred knowledge that had been suppressed by religious authorities, used his access to the construction site to secretly remove the grimoire from its holy water prison. The moment the book was removed from the blessed chamber, the containment system that had held it for 4 centuries collapsed completely, and the grimoire's full power was unleashed once again upon the world. The consequences of this release were felt immediately by supernatural sensitives throughout Europe. The continent was already spiritually weakened by the massive death and destruction of World War II, making it particularly vulnerable to the kind of corruption that the grimoire specialized in spreading. Giuseppe himself survived only 3 days after removing the grimoire from its prison. His body was found in his apartment with no signs of violence or natural cause of death, but with an expression of absolute terror permanently etched on his face. The grimoire was discovered lying open beside his body, its pages covered with symbols and texts that seemed to shift and change when viewed directly. The book's discovery attracted the attention of a secret society that had been monitoring supernatural activity in Florence for decades. This group, which called itself the Children of Darkness, represented a modern evolution of the medieval Children of Solomon, and its members had been waiting for centuries for the opportunity to claim the grimoire for their own purposes. The Children of Darkness were led by a wealthy industrialist named Count Vittorio Alberti, who had spent his entire adult life studying occult traditions and gathering magical artifacts. Count Alberti believed that he could succeed where previous grimoire owners had failed by approaching the book with modern scientific methodology and technological resources. However, Count Alberti's confidence in his ability to control the grimoire was based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what the book had become during its centuries of imprisonment. The entity that dwelt within the grimoire was no longer simply a repository of magical knowledge or even a conscious supernatural intelligence. It had evolved into something approaching a god, with power that transcended anything that human technology or magical technique could hope to contain. The Count's attempt to master the grimoire followed the same basic pattern that had been repeated throughout the book's history. Initial success and apparent control gave way to rapid physical and mental deterioration, followed by increasingly desperate attempts to satisfy the entity's growing demands for supernatural energy. However, the grimoire's ultimate goal was no longer simply to corrupt individual humans or even to spread its influence throughout human civilization. The book had spent centuries planning and preparing for a final apotheosis that would transform it from a supernatural entity operating within the physical world into a cosmic force capable of reshaping reality itself. This transformation would require a massive sacrifice of human life and spiritual energy on a scale that exceeded anything the grimoire had previously attempted. The book began to manipulate events to create the conditions necessary for this ultimate ritual, using its influence over the Children of Darkness and other corrupted individuals to orchestrate a supernatural catastrophe that would provide it with the power it needed to achieve godhood. The details of this final plan, and the efforts of various groups to prevent its completion, continue to this day. The grimoire remains active in the world, working through human agents and supernatural allies to prepare for what occult scholars believe will be the final battle between the forces of knowledge and ignorance, order and chaos, salvation and damnation. The location of Solomon's grimoire is currently unknown, but its influence can be detected by those who know what signs to look for. Unexplained mass psychological phenomena, technological failures that follow patterns suggesting supernatural interference, and the appearance of ancient symbols in modern contexts all suggest that the book continues to work toward its ultimate goal. Most terrifying of all is the possibility that the grimoire's centuries of evolution and power accumulation may have already progressed beyond the point where human intervention can stop it. The entity that began as King Solomon's attempt to gain power over supernatural forces may have become something that threatens not just human civilization, but the fundamental nature of reality itself.